historic room in the United States. Literally, it is the nation's birthplace. Here, the Continental Congress voted on the 2nd of July, 1776, that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. John Adams, the Boston radical who later became president, was there. He wrote to his wife that,
"The 2nd day of July, 1776, will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, bonfires, and illuminations, from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward, forevermore."
Adams got it wrong by 2 days. July the 4th, the day that the Declaration of Independence was presented to Congress, has become the American national holiday. But why did it happen at all? What turned people who had been loyal British subjects into revolutionaries who destroyed the first British Empire? Why did men and women who had revered George III as the best of kings become Republicans who rejected not only being British, but the whole idea of kingship? In this film, I will approach those questions by looking at one place, the city of Philadelphia. Philadelphia was not the whole of America, but in 1774, the colonials made it their capital when they picked it as the site for their first Continental Congress. This was where the American Revolution reached its crisis. I will concentrate on two men, Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine. Neither was a native Philadelphian, but both were here in 1776, and both had a major part in the final break. The dispute had begun with Parliament's assertion that it could tax the colonies itself without their consent. The claim threatened everyone's pocketbook because the taxes were to be paid in gold or silver, which the colonials just did not have. It also threatened the privileges of the colony's own rulers, who were used to running local affairs themselves. In larger terms, it seemed to threaten the colonials' whole sense that they enjoyed a full measure of British freedom. The colonials had seen Boston, the center of resistance, occupied by British troops in 1768. They had seen those troops open fire on American civilians in March 1770. They had seen Britain close Boston's harbor in 1774 to punish the town for its famous Tea Party the year before. Now, it was almost a year since the dispute had broken into open warfare. Thomas Jefferson was a great Virginia planter, master of both thousands of acres and more than 100 slaves. Educated at the College of William and Mary, he had no trouble joining Virginia's ruling elite as a member of the province's House of Burgesses. He was the main author of the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson went on to be President of the United States, but he listed the Declaration, and not the presidency, among the great achievements of his life to be recorded on his tombstone. Thomas Paine was an Englishman who only came to America in 1774. In his youth, Paine had been apprenticed to learn the trade of corset making. Even in America, one aristocrat dismissed him as a mere adventurer, without fortune, without family or connections, ignorant even of grammar. Grammatical or not, Paine's great pamphlet Common Sense was published in January 1776. For more than a decade, the colonies in Britain had been disputing about what the one owed to the other. Americans were ready for a strong argument in favor of independence, and when Paine provided it, they responded. Common Sense sold at least 150,000 copies in an age when selling a few thousand marked an enormous success. It was, Paine himself exulted, the greatest sale that any performance ever had since the use of letters. Both Jefferson and Paine were men of words, adept at summing up in powerful prose what other people were already thinking. By 1776, more and more people were thinking that the time for independence had come. Nonetheless, the two men produced very different documents aimed at different sorts of people. To know where they agreed and disagreed, to know where their worlds met and did not meet, is to appreciate something of the complexity of the American Revolution. The Philadelphia of Jefferson and Paine was an elegant, prosperous city. It had grown rich by trading the produce of the fertile surrounding countryside. It had about 30,000 people, making it large enough to rival any British city except London. Many of the buildings of 18th century Philadelphia still survive, and they tell us a great deal about what Philadelphians thought of themselves. Independence Hall was originally called the State House, and it was built for the provincial government. It contains the Assembly Chamber, where the Congress met and the Declaration was signed. It also has rooms for the Provincial Council and Supreme Court. Seeing this building, the State House, was a daily reminder that colonial Pennsylvanians lived under a British form of government. They took pride that their own representatives had a large say in determining public affairs. In their eyes, the assembly that met here was the local equivalent of the British House of Commons. Colonial legislatures, like the Pennsylvania Assembly or the Virginia House of Burgesses, did all they could to encourage that image. The State House was not Philadelphia's only mark of sophistication. Philosophical Hall was and is the headquarters of the American Philosophical Society. The society was founded in 1743 by Philadelphia's most famous citizen, Benjamin Franklin. It is the oldest learned society in the United States. The town could also boast the College of Philadelphia, now the University of Pennsylvania, and a public hospital which is still in use. Less privileged people also built places they could share. Carpenter's Hall was put up in 1770 by the Carpenters' Company, a guild of the city's master builders. The company was much like organizations of artisans that could be found all over Britain. Such groups still take part in the ceremonial life of the City of London. In the city of Philadelphia, the Carpenters' Company still owns Carpenter's Hall. Philadelphians took pride in their own history. To them, it began when William Penn made an honorable treaty with the Indians before establishing his colony. The Pennsylvania artist Benjamin West virtually invented the genre of modern dress history painting. In this, one of his greatest canvases, West commemorated Penn's treaty. In the 18th century, ambassadors from the Indian nations might be seen now and then in the city's streets. One of the most notable was the Mohawk Thayendanegea, more commonly known as Joseph Brant. Even years later, well into the 19th century, the Quaker folk artist Edward Hicks liked to use Penn's treaty to suggest that people of different races might live together in harmony. Most Philadelphians were religious people. Like their secular buildings, their churches tell us a lot about their identity. Christ Church was where the city's Anglicans worshipped. Its elegant exterior might not have been out of place in a prosperous English town. Inside, services followed the Anglican Book of Common Prayer. Every time they worshipped, the communicants of Christ Church were also announcing their sense of their own Englishness. Many of them were prosperous transatlantic merchants, bound to Britain by ties of trade as well as of faith and ritual. Not surprisingly, a good number decided to remain British when they found in 1776 that they had to make a choice. After all, they had always called England home. But perhaps even these were not as English as they thought. This is what Christ Church looks like inside. In the 18th century, it was more heavily decorated. But even then, it was different from a church like St. Mary's in the English county town of Warwick. Although the two were built at almost the same time, the American church lacks the choir, the decoration, and the sanctuary that are so prominent in the English one. Philadelphia's Anglican elite likewise differed from their English forebears. Many who did go into exile to escape the revolution learned painfully that England was not their home at all. Others who worshipped at Christ Church, such as Benjamin Franklin and, for a time, George Washington, knew that they were Americans all along. Philadelphia was famous for its Quakers, descendants of the founders of Pennsylvania. They, too, were often merchants with strong English ties. Like the Anglicans, many of them refused to accept independence. This is the Free Quaker Meeting House. It was built in 1783 by a breakaway group who did support the revolution. It is small, so was the group. Philadelphians were a diverse lot. Even before the Quakers came, there had been Swedish settlers in the Delaware Valley. Their 18th century descendants were still worshiping in their own way at Gloria Dei Church. There were Catholics enjoying a religious freedom they could not have had either in England itself or in any other American colony except Rhode Island. They built their first church on this site as early as 1733. There was a handful of Jews. They began burying their dead in Mikveh Israel Cemetery in 1738. Nor were those all. St. George's is the oldest Methodist church in continuous use in the whole country. The people it attracted tended to be poor and unsophisticated, not at all the sort who would feel at home among the wealthy communicants of Christ Church. There were many Scotch-Irish Presbyterians, lowland Scots who had settled for a time in Ulster before moving on to the New World. The house carpenter Matthew McGlathery was one of them. His portrait by Rembrandt Peale now hangs in Carpenter's Hall. Philadelphia had a congregation of German Lutherans who worshipped at the old Lutheran church in the original traditions of the German Reformation. There were enough Germans to support a German-language press. Among their descendants are the Amish Plain people who still live in central Pennsylvania. Their Pennsylvania Dutch speech is derived from the German their ancestors spoke. About 5% of Philadelphians were black, some of them free, many more held in slavery. We do not know the names of these two young girls whose images are caught in an 18th century print. But we do know that they and their people were beginning to shape a distinctive African-American way of life. Slave or free, black Philadelphians generally did the work that no one else wanted to do. In the Revolution's aftermath, they began to forge a freedom of their own. But they had to do it against enormous odds. One of their earliest churches held its services in a former blacksmith shop, which they hauled by hand from its former site near the city jail. They did find some white allies. One was Thomas Paine, who realized quickly that American slavery and American freedom went ill together. Another was Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration and one of Philadelphia's foremost physicians. A visitor can still see how many of the people of 18th century Philadelphia lived their daily lives. Bishop White House is a restored upper-class home. Inside, its owners displayed the finest styles, in furniture, in cutlery and tableware, and in clothing. The women and men who inhabited such a house could enjoy the best their world had to offer, just as Thomas Jefferson might do at Monticello, his Virginia plantation. But not all Philadelphians were well off. Elfreth's Alley is the oldest continuously inhabited street in the United States. Now, these brick houses are highly desirable. But in the 18th century, they were the homes of ordinary people, cramped places where they often worked as well as lived. This small chamber is a bedroom in the Mantua maker's house in Elfreth's Alley. During the Revolutionary period, this house was inhabited by Mary Smith, Sarah Melton, and Elizabeth Carr, single women who made their living by sewing dresses and other garments. Smith, Melton, and Carr were unusual because they were women on their own. But they lived in much the same way as other white Philadelphians who labored with their hands and received little for it. Others did much less well. There is little in today's Philadelphia to remind us of its population of indentured servants, European migrants who sold whole years of their lives in order to get to America. Nor could we know without looking at statistics that many Philadelphians could only survive on public assistance. For the ones who were worst off, the only remedy was the poorhouse, shown in this 18th century print. We have some sense now of what Philadelphia looked like in 1776, of who its people were, and of how they lived. Let us turn to what they actually did as their city became the focal point for the crisis of the American Revolution. Thomas Jefferson didn't seek the job of writing the Declaration of Independence, but John Adams, who was named to the drafting committee with him, convinced him that he would be the best man.
Reason first, you are a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to appear at the head of this business. Reason second, I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. You are very much otherwise. Reason third, you can write 10 times better than I.
Jefferson's writing was eloquent.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
It still rings true, and it has been borrowed many times all around the world. But Jefferson didn't act alone. This idealized painting by the revolutionary artist John Trumbull shows the drafting committee as it presented the Declaration to Congress. In addition to Jefferson and Adams, the committee included Roger Sherman of Connecticut, Robert R. Livingston of New York, and Benjamin Franklin. Sherman was a dour son of Puritan New England, as his portrait by Ralph Earl shows. In his youth, Sherman had been a shoemaker. Now he had risen in the world and was practicing law. Sherman would be the only man to sign all three of the great state documents of the era: the Declaration, the Articles of Confederation, and the United States Constitution. Like Sherman, Benjamin Franklin came from lowly origins. He learned the printing trade in his native Boston and came to Philadelphia when he was still a youth. He prospered, and by 1776 he had long since retired from his print shop. His elegant house has been demolished, but its bare outline has been reconstructed, and it gives some sense of its owner's standing. By 1776, Franklin enjoyed not only wealth, but also world fame for his scientific discoveries. He held an honorary doctorate from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. He had also made himself a politician of consummate skill, but he still referred to himself by his trade: I, Benjamin Franklin, printer. Like Sherman and Adams, Robert R. Livingston was a lawyer. He came from the very top of New York's ruling elite of landlords and merchants. Like many others in his own social group, he feared the possibilities that the revolution was letting loose. Later, he would recall the strategy his own kind adopted of yielding to the torrent in order to direct its course, and of swimming with a stream it is impossible to stem. Most of the men in Congress were in fact gentlemen, like Jefferson, Adams, and Livingston, rather than climbers like Sherman and Franklin. They held degrees from colleges like Harvard, Yale, and William and Mary. They owned counting houses and ships, broad acres and slaves. William Floyd's portrait shows not only his face, but also his estate on Long Island, east of New York City. Some, like Maryland's Charles Carroll of Carrollton, or New Jersey's Reverend John Witherspoon, had even studied in Europe. One of the richest congressmen was the Boston merchant John Hancock. As president, Hancock signed the Declaration first. One might gather from such a group that ordinary people and their concerns, hopes, and fears had little to do with the revolution. But that would be wrong. The leaders of the American movement had always pursued two different goals. One was militance in the face of British pressure. The other was the broadest possible agreement about what was to be done. That is one reason why the drafting committee formed so diverse a group, both geographically and socially. The diversity of the American movement could be found outside Congress more than within it. When the First Continental Congress assembled in September 1774, it met in Carpenter's Hall, rather than in the more capacious State House a few hundred feet away. This was a deliberate snub to colonial Pennsylvania's most powerful politician, Joseph Galloway. As Speaker of the Provincial Assembly, Galloway had offered the use of the State House, but he was already known as a friend to Great Britain. He went to the First Congress despite the snub, and there he pursued policies so mild that the Congress obliterated the record of his dealings from its journal. By the time Congress reassembled in May 1775, Galloway had lost his power. Only then did Congress move to the larger and more elegant building which he had once controlled. The choice of Carpenter's Hall had also been a compliment to the working people of Philadelphia, like Matthew McGlathery. These are the tools that someone like McGlathery would have used. By the Revolution's end, working men were making their tools, and the strength and skill it took to use them, into political symbols. Here is the banner that the carpenters displayed when they marched on July the 4th, 1788, in a great parade that celebrated the Revolution's achievements. The banners of other artisan groups were even more explicit that day. Both buildings and rulers are the work of our hands, was the slogan of the city's bricklayers. By hammer in hand, all arts do stand, became the motto of the smiths. Since the very beginning of the crisis with Britain, shoemakers and carpenters, and bricklayers and blacksmiths had been establishing a reputation for just the sort of militants that Joseph Galloway so clearly lacked. Working men like Matthew McGlathery and the gentlemen who came to Congress got to know one another very well in 1774, 1775, and 1776. The most determined of the congressmen were the delegates from Massachusetts, like John Adams and his cousin Samuel, and from Virginia, like Thomas Jefferson. Quickly they formed an alliance with ordinary Philadelphians who wanted to push harder than their own province's timid leaders were willing to go. John Dickinson was one of those leaders. In the 1760s, he had made some of the strongest arguments against British policy, but now he temporized and hesitated. In a private letter, an exasperated John Adams once called him a great fortune and piddling genius because of his timidity. When the British captured the letter and published it, Adams was embarrassed, but not repentant. While Jefferson was in Congress, he stayed in the house of a German bricklayer named Jacob Graf. This modern reconstruction shows what it looked like. Graf was not a wealthy man, nor in all probability was he highly cultured. But Jefferson must nonetheless have found Graf's politics congenial. Jacob Graf became one of the foremost of Philadelphia's bricklayers. He led his trades contingent in the Great Procession of 1788, but he remained a man of modest means. Thomas Jefferson was not. In the months that Jefferson lived in Graf's house, he put his own imprint on the rooms he was renting, as these modern reconstructions show. Cooperation across class and province lines between the wealthy Virginian and the Pennsylvania working man was central to the Revolution's success. To most of the congressmen, the great issue was Great Britain. After a decade of dispute with Britain, they were convinced that both their own privileges and American liberties were in danger. Even men like John Dickinson and Robert R. Livingston came round to accepting the need for independence, but they saw little need for change in America itself. Thomas Jefferson was probably more open to change than most men of his sort, but he controlled his prose in the Declaration. He asserted that people had the right to make revolution if they wanted to, but prudence indeed would dictate that they should be reluctant to use it. Jefferson wrote a powerful attack on King George.
The history of the present king of Great Britain is a long history of abuses and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states.
Like a lawyer in a courtroom, he submitted his evidence to a candid world in order to prove his case. Men like Jefferson and Franklin also understood that America would need foreign aid, and that monarchical France was the most likely source. In fact, the French were already providing secret help through a fictitious trading firm. Jefferson had no love of monarchy, and he would applaud the French Revolution when it happened. But he was careful in the Declaration to confine his attack to the supposed misdeeds of one king only. It would make no sense for the Americans to offend Louis XVI. The Declaration was radical, but it was also diplomatic. It was also a document that men like Robert R. Livingston and John Dickinson could accept. Paine was not writing an official document, and it made no difference whom he offended. For years, he had been moving among working people, and now he spoke for them. To Paine, King George was the royal brute of England, and the lesson of the times was simple: 'tis time to part. Paine attacked the whole idea of kingship.
Monarchy and succession have laid the world in blood and ashes. 'Tis a form of government which the word of God bears testimony against, and blood will attend it.
Paine's goal was to transform political involvement from a gentleman's privilege to a citizen's right. He had much more in mind than just making the hapless George III look like a royal brute. Government, he wrote, like clothing, is a badge of lost innocence. The innocence could not be regained, but Americans needed no king or aristocracy. Simple democracy would suit them well. Let the assemblies be annual, Paine said, with a president only to see to day-to-day administration. There was no reason why a Matthew McGlathery or a Jacob Graf should not become an assemblyman or even a president himself. Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine were political allies. So, in larger terms, were the gentlemen in Congress who voted for independence and the people from New Hampshire to Georgia who applauded it and who fought for it. But quite clearly, Jefferson and Paine wrote for different readers with different ideas of what independence ought to be. Jefferson was radical enough when he asserted in the Declaration that all men are created equal. not many Englishmen would have said anything of the kind. All he really had in mind, however, was that the Americans were as good as a people as the English who claimed the right to rule them. Even then, Paine was going farther. Not everyone agreed with common sense. John Adams loathed everything about the pamphlet except its call for independence. Nonetheless, the evidence is clear that many people did both read and agree. To them, independence marked the starting place, not the end, of the real American Revolution. 11 years later, in 1787, another historic gathering met here in this same room. It was the convention that wrote the present Constitution of the United States. Among the delegates was the aged Benjamin Franklin. George Washington was the convention's president, and day after day, he sat in this chair while the members deliberated. On the back of the chair, there is a sun in splendor. As the convention was finally adjourning, with its work completed, Franklin rose to speak. He had often wondered, he said, whether the sun on the chair was rising or setting. But now he was sure that it was a rising and not a setting sun. As we have seen, that national dawn was the work of many sorts of people. The gentlemen who gathered here in 1776 and again in 1787 developed their own strong sense of what American equality ought to mean. Ultimately, they decided, national strength would count most if the United States was to be an equal among the nations of a very harsh world. Thomas Paine's people, like our carpenter Matthew McGlathery, would not have objected to the notion of national strength at all. But to them, what counted most was equal rights. 2 centuries later, the tension between Jefferson's vision of Americans equal to any other people in the world and Paine's vision of Americans equal to one another remains not wholly resolved.
Come join hand in hand, brave Americans all, and rouse your bold hearts at liberty's call. No tyrannous act shall suppress your just claim, or stain with dishonor America's name. In freedom we're born, and in freedom we'll live. Our purses are ready, steady, friends, steady. Not as slaves, but as free men, how money we'll give.